everyone. Thank you for joining the beta launch of our UK Net Zero Finance Tracker. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the CPI website in a few days. If you're having any technical issues at all, please just message me. I'm listed as the CPI host via the chat function. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please submit them through the Q&A function and we will do our best to respond. And with that, I will hand it off to Barbara Buchner, CPI's Global Managing Director.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you all so much for joining today. As Carolyn said, I'm Barbara Buchner. I'm the Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative. We know it's a very busy week in the UK for those of us keen on climate action, so we really appreciate that you take the time to be with us today. CPI is well known for its climate finance tracking work. This project here started over a year ago when we could see that there was a huge need for making sense of and catalyzing finance and action, aligning financing with Paris Agreement and net zero transition goals. This need has only become more clear as we see more and more pronouncements on net zero targets, especially ahead of COP26. There's currently no way of objectively determining how those announcements translate to meaningful action on the ground. And we strongly believe that integrity and accountability is more important than ever. And we're working with many partners and many on the line today to contribute to a clear pathway to financial system integrity and materiality, hopefully smoothing the financial sector's move towards sustainability and net zero and reinforcing the multiplier effect these actions will have on achievements in the real economy. As part of this effort to bring integrity to sustainable finance, CPI also recently released a draft framework for sustainable finance integrity. And this framework is really a set of guardrails that's aimed at defining and fostering integrity in the financial sector's efforts to deliver sustainability and net zero pathways. And thus far, it is the only framework that provides uniform guidance across the full suite of public and private financial action. So the framework is on our website, the links provided in the chat, and we really would love your feedback as we want to refine the framework and really making sure that we help use it to help others to move towards more action in the future. So the framework sets the guardrails for action, and the Net Zero Finance Tracker fills the need for a monitoring and accountability tool to track action across the financial sector on net zero, on Paris alignment. Our team at CPI has been working extremely hard on crunching all of the data available out there that contributes to the understanding of current financial sector action and on Paris alignment by UK entities. So the main objective of today's meeting is to introduce you to the UK beta dashboard, but of course we would love it if you will use the tracker, you will share the tracker, and you will provide feedback as we expand and refine the tracker from a UK beta version to a more robust tracking platform. Again, please remember this is a beta version, so there may be some hiccups as we review the site. In terms of agenda today, we will provide a little background on our work and our vision for the tracker before giving you an overview of the approach and then walking you through the demo of the tracker. After that, we will have an open Q&A session, and as we start to think beyond the UK beta to see how we can develop the tracker and trackers with a global view and other regional and national views, we are also looking for feedback on how this tool might fit strategically with other initiatives. So I'd like to take just a moment here to thank all of the member organizations who helped in the development of the tracker, some of whom are here with us today. And I also would like to thank the European Climate Foundation and the government of Austria for funding the initial development stages of the tracker. And with that, again, thanks for being here. And let me hand over to Angela Falconer, the director of our UK office.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and great to see all of you on joining us today. Our vision for the Net Zero Finance Tracker is a collaborative platform to assess the response of public and private finance to climate change. This is a work in progress that will require considerable collaboration and iteration over multiple years to build comprehensive global and national views. Core to the Net Zero Finance Tracker vision are data visualization dashboards, which draw on a number of reporting initiatives and data sources that contribute a piece of the picture on Paris alignment and net zero progress. We draw on both qualitative data showing leading indicators of action, as well as quantitative data on capital allocation and real economy investment flows. Alongside the dashboards, we need to work collaboratively to fill data and knowledge gaps and use the evidence to inform decision-making of investors and policymakers. And on that note, we're very glad to have 25 organisations listed here already joining us officially as part of the work of the Net Zero Finance Tracker member network, and to have received significant input from dozens more organisations to help ensure integrity and usefulness of this tool. While of course all responsibility for content rests with CPI and not the member or funder organisations. A word on our long-term direction and ambition for the tracker is to work towards a collaborative platform. This figure shows an example of how data and research collaborations could develop over time around a model that provides a shared open data using common standards and shared technical infrastructure. However, the immediate priority next steps are to expand the scope of the dashboard to a global view, to establish and formalize data and institutional partnerships, to update and strengthen the methodology, in particular in relation to benchmarks on Paris alignment, and advance our data process and architecture and automation. But now back to the focus today. My colleague Valerio Michele is going to walk you through the UK Beta dashboard, key findings and methodology. So over to you, Valerio.
Thank you very much, Angela. I'm first going to go over some high-level highlights from what the dashboard can reveal about our progress or lack thereof towards Paris alignment. I'll then go over some of the key methodology behind the dashboard itself. One of the trends of the tracker shows that the number of UK institutions starting to take action on climate has increased rapidly since the Paris Agreement, particularly in the last couple of years, although part of this is a result of improved data coverage over the time. The image you see here on the bottom corresponds to the tracker, which we will preview live after these highlights. While the numbers of institutions joining the Paris race has increased, there is still room to improve the quality of their level of engagement. We assess that the majority of institutions are at just an initial stage of their response and are on average implementing only a few of the measures available to them. Further, the tracker shows that the institution's response is on average stronger at the strategic level, meaning setting targets and climate strategies, and weaker when integrating them in their day-to-day operations. Another aspect of the tracker is highlighting early leaders on climate action in each category of financial actor topology, such as banks, insurance companies, and pension funds. As we can see from the top right graph, there is a wide and sometimes growing gap between the level of response by a small number of early leaders and the average response of the rest of the pack. Early leaders in this case are acting as a sort of a vanguard and setting the bar for their peers about what is already possible and achievable today. Another thing we notice is that large institutions are performing on average relatively better due to higher availability of resources to set targets and operationalize transition. So how does that translate downstream? If we look at the portfolio alignment graph on the bottom right part of the slide, we found that there are 10 times as many institutions with misaligned portfolios as there are with aligned portfolios. If we look at preliminary data on underlying asset managed or owned by the same institution, that proportion grows to 35 times as many institutions with misaligned assets, suggesting that unlike measures and goals, leadership in the realignment of portfolio is more frequent in smaller, likely more flexible organizations. In addition to looking at institutions in the financial sector, the tracker also looks at progress in 6 real economy sectors. When looking at how things are progressing for the UK as a recipient of climate finance or target of all the transition efforts, we can see that every sector needs to achieve steep cuts over the coming decade. Data from the UK Committee on Climate Change suggests that the power sector will need to decrease its emission from 2020 levels by 90% by 2040, while transport and land use are the only sectors that can continue to have some level of emissions past 2050, with these emissions offset elsewhere in the economy. Because of this, annual investment need to increase by several multiples. After a slowdown in 2017 and 2018, low carbon powered investment needs to peak in 2030. Further, investment in electric vehicles need to be over 10 times greater than the 2014-2019 average. So what are these takeaways based on? We have a detailed methodology document posted to the website in case anyone wants to do a deeper dive. But for now, because the methodology is key to the integrity for the tracker, we wanted to give you a quick summary of where most efforts have been so far invested. Also, like the tracker itself, which is currently in beta, this is a living methodology. The idea is to continuously update and improve this methodology as long as new data is available and new concepts are developed. So our dashboard looks at progress on net zero using two perspectives. As you can see in this slide, the first perspective on the left looks at progress in a country's financial sector or country as a source of green finance. In other words, for this UK pilot, this means that we are tracking activities of institutions headquartered in the UK, but that might be involved in financial activities and investments into the UK or other countries internationally. The second perspective on the right provides the domestic picture, looking at the progress of a country in its transition to net zero in the country's real economy, as institutions both domestic and international finance the green in key sectors such as agriculture, power, transport, and so on. So for example, the investment recorded under each view are not exactly the same flows, and while domestic investments in the UK are presented under both views, under both the institutions and real economy views, international outbound flows provided by UK institutions are in scope under the institution view, while the real economy view includes international inbound flows from institutions abroad which affect climate outcomes in the UK. For short, we refer to these views as institutions and real economy hereafter. In the dashboard, we assess progress under three dimensions of Paris alignment: targets, integration, and flows, which act as proxies of how organizations are responding to the Paris challenges at different levels of governance, from intention set at strategic level through its progressive integration in day-to-day operations and due diligence until the final downstream allocation into investment flows. We know that flows are what ultimately matters. However, this is where data and benchmarks are mostly lacking. And in that sense, the targets and integration dimensions can be intended as a way to point out to progress that will result in future flows. These three dimensions are measured so far by 18 indicators, which rely on about 200 datasets harvested from 36 different data sources. The underlying data they provide are of very, very different nature in terms of aim and type, which adds to the challenge that also varies in terms of availability and coverage. We have mainly relied on publicly accessible data, although we are starting to build partnerships with private data providers as we move ahead. And finally, to give you a sense of the effort required to build the first version of this tool with relatively small resources, I wanted to share some of the work needed to build the institutions and the real economy parts of the dashboard. For the institutions dashboard, as shown on the left part of the slide, most efforts has been invested in identifying the vast majority of data sources previously mentioned. Further to that, we looked at the 2,000 individual entities and retrieved data for about 1,200, which represent about 25 trillion in assets owned or managed. Because the data are coming from so many different sources, each classifying entities their own way, we had to undergo a massive standardization effort. We also collected preliminary data on assets owned or managed, so that in assessing the impact of these institutions, we would also be able to reflect their relative weight in the economy. In order to assess sector alignment, in the case of real economy, as shown on the right side of the slide, we focus on fewer key sources. Data from CPI's landscape of climate finance is used for data on investment in low carbon climate resilient projects, and data from the UK Committee on Climate Change to illustrate historical emissions, projected emissions under decarbonization scenarios, and future investment needs. And now let me hand it over to my colleague, Rob Macquarie, who will navigate you through the beta version of the dashboard that's tested for the UK.
Thank you, Valerio. I'm just going to take over the screen sharing. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Could I please just get a confirmation here I can see? Everyone can see the screen.
All good, Rob.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. So as mentioned, this is a beta version, so please bear with us and with any issues you may notice as we now walk you through the site. But we begin with the dashboard homepage and a choice between the two views that Vale has just mentioned. So the institutions view looks at progress in the UK's financial system, while the real economy focuses on the transition to net zero in domestic economic sectors. And you can still switch between the two views via the bar at the top. And there's also the option to learn more about the tracker and its ambition, including the information that's been shared by my colleagues today. And if you'd like to learn more about the methodology, this link opens a separate document which guides you through in much more detail. But today we're going to focus on the data. So the institutions view, which you can see here, summarizes action by 12 different categories of private institutions. Now, every institution which we've measured in the dashboard are headquartered in the UK, but importantly, their investments measured can be domestic or international. You can see the 3 dimensions of progress that have been described already displayed here in the top left. So that's targets, integration, and flows. Now, responding entities, the first view, simply describes how widespread the observed responses are. So over 1,000 responding institutions are included in the dashboard. This chart to the left shows progress across the financial system as a whole. So that's all institution categories together, while the rest of the categories are visible in the middle of the screen here. Now, there are 2 options for viewing the data and representing progress. As well as the absolute number of institutions reporting, users can also switch to see the underlying assets they represent. So that reflects the weight the individual actions by each institution are going to have in the financial system. However, there are some issues in gathering comprehensive and reliable data here. So the default view is the number of institutions, and the assets view is a preliminary component only that we expect to improve in future versions of the dashboard. A quick word on how to read the charts. If you're ever in doubt, an explanation can be found in the top right, always to the top right of each chart. So as described in the methodology run through, targets and integration have composite scores from a range of indicators. And within each of these views, users have got further choices. It's possible first to view the distribution of scores across reporting institutions each year, as you're currently seeing. Here you can see the shades of green reflecting different strengths of response. So the darkest shade is always the highest quality. For example, you can see here that foundations have a higher share of robust targets than endowments and subsequently of asset managers. Another option is to see the average score compared to the score of the early leader in each category. So if we go to integration and switch to average score, we'll see that visualization. Early leaders, which are these dashed gray lines, are the institutions within each category setting the bar for their peers. It's interesting to observe very strong early leaders in some groups. So for example, we have pension funds where leaders are adopting, as well as disclosing climate risks, but leaders are also adopting climate scenario tools and setting internal incentives related to climate performance. Again, within this average score view, we can switch between number and underlying assets. So selecting assets adjusts the distribution adjust the distribution by showing what volume of assets are associated with each grade of response to climate change. Whereas with the average score, it adjusts the average by weighting each institution's response according to their underlying assets. The early leader line is unchanged because that simply represents the score of a single institution. So if we look at that again, we can see that scores often rise when weighted by assets. For instance, notice how the line for corporates jumps up. So that's likely because larger institutions have more resources to dedicate to some of these integration measures. To understand what drives the composite score, hovering over the chart and clicking on this drivers brings up the option to see a ranking of different indicators in terms of their impact. We'll look a bit more at the indicators in a moment. But first we'll look to flows, within which there are two angles to be able to view separately. Investment trends shows primary investments into assets and activities related to climate mitigation goals, as well as total green bond issuance. While portfolio alignment shows the results of institutions which are using leading methodologies to assess the investments they hold against Paris benchmarks. So as Valeria already highlighted, flows is the dimension where we see least progress so far. Now, on the one hand, that's logical if targets and integration are seen as triggers for higher investment flows. But we need to see those effects flowing through quickly if we're going to be able to meet Paris goals in the economy as a whole. So our ambition for the tracker is to help understand that mechanism, how targets catalyze integration and integration catalyze flows in much more detail. So if we click explore, or even just click on the chart itself, we can go to a page much more specific to the institution type. So below this first chart, which is the same measure of the extent of reporting as the total in the overview level, the dimensions are below arranged side by side. So this view therefore lets us see how groups are performing on targets compared to integration, and whether those actions in each dimension are translating into flows. Within the text below these charts, we indicate some further details, including calling out institutions who represent early leaders. So for example, within asset managers, we've seen particularly high scores from Schroders on targets and from Legal & General on integration. Furthermore, at the institution category level, we can also see the underlying indicators which drive the composite scores. For example, we can see that less than half of asset managers starting to carry out climate risk due diligence have actually embedded the practice at both operational and strategic levels, as you can see in the legend below the chart here. Now, I want to quickly remind that these indicators are themselves constructed from several data sets. And you can see which data sets are included by hovering over how to read, again, to the top right of the chart. Much more information is available in the methodology, of course. So at the moment, within the dashboard, the indicators are the most granular level, but we aim to show results for individual institutions in future iterations of the dashboard. Now let's also spend a bit of time looking at the real economy view. So here we've collected data on emissions and investments in 6 key economic sectors, as well as an overview of emissions in the UK economy as a whole and how fast they need to decline to reach net zero. The scenario that we've chosen to show here is the Climate Change Committee's balanced pathway in the 6th carbon budget. That was published in December. The interim target of a 78% cut in emissions compared to 1990 by 2035 that the CCC recommended is now enshrined in UK law. So the importance of focusing on this net zero pathway is that it informs the scale of investment we need to see. The CCC models operational costs and capital investment required to meet the pathway. In the dashboard, we focus only on capital investments to highlight the role of the financial sector. Now, the investments that we track here are not exactly the same as those within the institutions view. The reason for that is that the real economy view monitors action affecting climate outcomes in the UK. So flows can either be domestic from UK-based institutions, or indeed international from international-based institutions into the UK. And that second group would not be included in the institutions view. Every sector is visible here in this overview level, and we can see the emissions pathway in each and how historical investment patterns shape up compared to needs. And clicking on a chart for a particular sector foregrounds that sector and highlights some of the key challenges that their sector faces. For example, investment in the power sector should peak into the next decade, as relatively expensive flexible generation like hydrogen needs to come online to support variable renewables. So between these two views, the aim of the tracker is to capture the different but equally important angles of progress in decarbonisation. And in future, we hope to unpack the relationship between the institutions and the real economy. One final reminder that this is a UK-focused beta dashboard, and our future ambition is to replicate this for global and additional national and regional views. So with that, I will hand back over to Angela, who's going to moderate our Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob and Valerio, for that great walkthrough and overview of the Net Zero Finance Tracker UK dashboard beta. So now we have a good 20 minutes or so for open Q&A. Thanks to those of you who have already posted your questions. We'd encourage you to use the Q&A function. That's the easiest for us to manage, but we also have someone monitoring the chat if you want to put your question or comment in there. We really welcome all comments and questions, especially as this is a beta. We might not have time to get through all of the questions, but we will continuously be updating a frequently asked questions document on our website in the About section. So please do continue to add in your questions. Anything really also on the use cases here for this work going forward would be welcome. I think we've got folks on the webinar from the private sector, civil society and academia. We're really keen to hear what would be useful to you in building a better understanding of where things are at with Paris alignment. So without further ado, let's get started on the questions. I'm going to ask Valerio to answer a couple of questions that have come in around whether we can see individual institution scores within the dashboard. And maybe related to that, Valerio, the question of leaders that we mark out in the dashboard. What does it mean to be a leader? What would a 100 score mean, if that is even possible? And maybe if you can give some examples of who the leaders are.
Yeah, sure. So to answer to the first question regarding the individual financial institution score from Karen, there are two reasons behind this choice, for which at the moment we decided to focus mainly in presenting data at aggregate level by financial actor type. The first one is that on one hand, we didn't want to pick on specific institutions. We got feedback in that direction as we were developing the dashboard initially, but rather focus on trends at actor category level that are useful to judge sectoral performance and determine benchmarks for sector peers. However, we did decide to name early leaders when some emerge from the group, given that it is useful for telling us what is achievable now, as I mentioned before, and of course also to give a hint about how the data was produced, which is through the assessment of scores for individual entities. And the second reason why we not disclosing at the moment scores at the level of individual entities, proprietary issues. So we can show, of course, underlying data developed by other data providers when they are only privately accessible, unless there is a specific agreement. This is particularly true for investment data that relies on fewer privately owned data sets and then cannot really be shown as aggregated. While there is definitely the possibility in the future to show data at the institutional level for target and integration dimension scores, and we believe that in the future we can also look at that, and perhaps also showing some of the scores for the underlying indicators. And in this sense, I think it's also worth mentioning that another project that we are developing in parallel, which focuses on commitments by the top 100 asset managers and owners for the COP26. And in that effort, we're really relying on data scrapping from public available news, and this data will be shareable, and as there will not be like a proprietary issue in that sense. In terms of what the score means at the moment, I think Angela mentioned like what at the moment when we score the aggregate broader aggregate score for the target dimension in the integrated dimension. This is a function basically of underlying indicators that we identified as attributes that characterize each of these two dimensions. So an entity that would score, the highest the entity would score under each of these two dimension targets and integration, the more it means that they will access and deploy the entire portfolio of instruments that are available to them to actually allow them to perform a transition towards a low carbon economy.
Okay, thank you, Valerio. So just to answer a couple of clarifying questions that have come through. When will this be ready to use? Now is the answer. I'm pleased to say it's up and live. The link is in the chat, netzerofinancetracker.org, and you will be able to also navigate to that from our own CPI website soon as well. And I believe there's been another question as to whether the methodology is available for public review. Yes, that is also on the same website under the About section. There's I think some 60 pages of description of the methodology, and we'd certainly welcome any feedback and suggestions from you on that. So now let me go perhaps to Rob with another question that's come through regarding pension funds. There is much conversation about unlocking such institutional cash pools. What is your impression of the flows of this subsector in the UK? And perhaps, Rob, you can tell us a little bit about what we can see in the dashboard already from the pension fund sector.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you for the question. It's great to talk about these institutional investors, which are undeniably really important institution types. And yes, I'll reiterate that within this dashboard, we're trying to connect the targets integration measures, but then through to two categories of flows. So the ambition is to cover both what we call primary investments directly into assets and activities, and also financial market transactions. Now, the type of what we would call those financial market transactions secondary flows, and the type of secondary flows we've currently got in this beta dashboard are green bond issuances. And so with that kind of financial flow, the pension fund on the one hand, are relatively unlikely to be involved there. And with primary investments into assets and activities, that's also sometimes happens, but very rarely for pension funds, which are obviously quite far up the investment chain away from that kind of activity. Nevertheless, in our global tracking work, we've and indeed just seen some announcements by some institutions to seek innovative ways to pool capital and channel them into projects. But in the future, certainly we're hoping to close data gaps, especially around those financial market transactions, that we would be able to see money flowing from pension funds into companies, which are then in turn taking climate action. And our hope for the dashboard is that it's going to facilitate improved and encourage improved reporting once a use case for comprehensive reporting across the economy is gradually built, and the ability to understand and monitor how integration and demonstrate how integration measures especially are contributing to those greater flows. The one thing I would also want to say again is that we do have portfolio alignment covering those institutions, and so while the portfolio alignment is not a measure of flows over time, it's more an assessment of holdings. That's still a really important indicator at the moment with the current data for institutions like institutional investors, pension funds, and the like. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Rob. And now we've got a question here. Please do come forward with any other questions or or comments that you have. But we have a really great one here, which goes to the heart of the issue of alignment. So it mentions that Barbara Buchner talked about the real economy impacts from financial institutions. And of course, this is what we really want to get to. Can we elaborate on how this tool, excuse me, could help in getting more insights into the real economy impact? So maybe, Valerio, if we can go to you and hear more about how alignment is defined within the tracker, how close we've been able to get to that so far, if we're using benchmarks, and how we compare the flow data.
Yeah, starting from this initial part, so how do we define alignment? So in the two views, so the institution views and the real economy view, I think we use slightly different approaches to define what alignment means. So for the institution view, in that case, we really look at it as the holistic effort an institution needs to put into place in order to shift from towards shift and enable a transition towards a low carbon economy. So in the case, we really look at the different level of governance and under which actions needs to be taken to enable such transition. Then in the second view, which is the real economy view, in the case, the focus is really on sector. So how that is impacting the country ability to align with the decarbonization scenarios. And in this case, we look at a more like a narrow and focused definition of alignment and more comparable with science-based approaches that really look how like the decarbonization pathway in terms of emissions, but also in terms of how investment needs are being met, are aligning with the needs. In terms of really the real economy question, so this is in part now covered in this section of the second section of the dashboard that I just talked about, the one that looks into sector alignment, trends of emissions, and trends of investment. But it is also in part covered also in the flow section of the dashboard, the institution level dashboard. In this case, we're looking at the two types of flow, one being like investment flows, which includes primary investment in low carbon climate resilient technologies, as well as trends on green bonds, and then the portfolio alignment, which looks at how assets, at least a portion of the assets or the portfolio which is exposed to climate change, is aligning to the different decarbonization pathways. Of course, to enhance and make sure that progress is measured against such pathways, we need to have benchmarks in the sense. This was also Angela mentioned. Now, we do have used benchmarks in the real economy view at sectoral level, as Rob illustrated before, and we do use them in portfolio analysis. In this case, we rely on third-party entities that have been assessing the level of alignment of the portion portfolio exposed with to climate change. But at the moment we do not cover, and I think that's where I think research is very welcome, and of course looking forward to integrating more and more sources in the dashboard over the time, is alignment on new investment. And currently there are no benchmarks about how new investment decisions are in line with the decarbonization pathways for new investment decision. I mean, I refer to capital allocations by financial actors, and to this extent, is worth mentioning a work we've been producing at the end of last year on Paris alignment. For the first time, we tried to develop a methodology that would allow to enable such a comparison. The only reason it's not being embedded in the dashboard so far is that it's a one-off exercise, so only covers 1 year and will not be able to disclose year-to-year changes. So I hope this answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Valerio. And now let's go. There's another meaty question that's come in about the real estate investments. So we'll go back to Rob to hear about that one. So I think in particular, asking, how tracking in this sector of investments can be done. How can we improve data to understand flows in this sector, and should this be led by institutions themselves? Before I hand to you, Rob, and the sort of technical side of it, I think, we're really hoping also through this tracker we can build a lot of collaboration between data providers and institutions working in the real economy to try to fill some of these gaps in understanding our data over time. But I'll hand to Rob for some more reflections from the tracker.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. Indeed, a very perceptive technical question here. So just to kind of be clear that the data we're drawing on for recording primary investments comes from the Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which is a project that CPI has been doing for some years. And indeed, anyone familiar with reading those reports will know that energy efficiency not just energy efficiency, but indeed that's the primary use for the building sector. But buildings is something that's very difficult to track. But this is a juncture moment where we hope that the data coverage for that sector is going to start to improve very soon. CPI is currently in the process of some analytical research to quantify or estimate the investment behind new green buildings in many regions of the world. So it's using this kind of new data on newly registered green buildings and estimated investment costs to start to fill in that gap. Of course, this is tricky analytical work that's going to have to take several steps to actually connect up to the providers of finance, and then to have the kind of value and use case that we're hoping for the tracker to have in future. And that's where, as the question here alludes to, and Angela has said, indeed, we'd hope that partnerships and institutional collaboration could perhaps join data sets up and start to show how new buildings or measures within buildings have been provided finance, like further up the line by institutions. And in fact, we're seeing a lot of great work already. To take the UK as the example, still, with the Coalition for Energy Efficiency, I think I've not got the name quite right, but led by the Green Finance Institute there, thinking, and if we could see, for example, banks starting to be more transparent about particular programs they're running to provide loans to green mortgages, and we can connect those to new green real estate investment, then yeah, we could start to see a much more complete data picture there. So hopefully there's progress afoot in that area.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Rob. And I'm not going to let you off the hook just yet. I'm going to come back for just a couple of more clarification questions. I think that these haven't come up in the Q&A, but I know they come up often, whether we cover adaptation in our dashboard and also public flows, because we've seen quite a lot here of the different private financial actor categories. But maybe if you can say a word on public and adaptation resilience very briefly.
Absolutely. So public institutions are not currently within the scope of this dashboard, indeed, but I think that in future there's no reason for them not to be. The difference with public would be whether they crop up in certain qualitative data sets around that are primarily private sector initiatives in some cases to get firms to sign up to, but there's no reason why metrics could not also be constructed for public institutions. And indeed, we do already have data on public flows that are drawn from the global landscape again, and other data sets on bond issuances, climate bonds initiative, and so on. With respect to adaptation, it's important to retain a bit of nuance in understanding how adaptation features in this. As everyone will notice, it's called the Net Zero Finance Tracker. So the focus is on mitigation goals and mitigation finance. However, the nature of climate finance is often that it might provide dual benefits. So there might be benefits for mitigation and for adaptation in a single project. And furthermore, within the real economy view in particular, the modeling done by the Climate Change Committee to chart a balanced pathway towards net zero goals has to and takes into account adaptation measures that are needed across the economy as a whole within the time frame of that balanced pathway being carried out, so up to 2050, because it wouldn't be a coherent model and a coherent projection of investments needed to get emissions down without considering those inevitable necessary responses in the adaptation front that are going to need to happen. And because of that, those, well, commensurate with those benchmarks containing some adaptation measures are flows measured within the real economy view, in some cases are also adaptation focused, but again in line with the really dominant or the picture we see, I should say, in global climate finance when we track flows, with mitigation really dominant in terms of the amount of finance that we can track going to investments. It's safe to say that the vast majority of data that you'll see within this within the dashboard does relate to mitigation, but that's not to say that adaptation is completely excluded, by no means.
Thank you, Rob. And I think we've got time for just a couple of last questions, so please do post those if you have any other questions. In the meantime, back to Valerio to remark on the couple of questions we've had on whether we plan to expand out on the corporates that are covered, and maybe you can say a bit about which corporates are covered at the moment, and what the process was like for compiling and processing the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I think I can combine the two questions because are very much related. The question that from Karen and Angelina, I believe. So I'll start from the data. So this has been a very data-driven effort in the sense that our starting point has been a general understanding. So we developed an initial framework top-down about what overall dimension we wanted to cover and what initial indicators and attributes we wanted to scope data about. But that very framework has been then shaped over the time by the data that we were collecting over the time from the very many initiatives that are out there already. So it is what you can define it as a sort of metadata type of effort. So where we collect tracking efforts that are being already done in a more sectoral or more limited scope by a lot of other initiatives out there. And I gave you some numbers before in terms of the sources that we were able to scope so far, like view so far, like from 36 data sources and around like 200 different data sets, providing each providing a different information. Now, these sources are mainly like publicly available, the ones that we've been using so far, with some exception for some data set we use in particularly for flows. In terms of data effort, in terms of data analysis efforts, so a lot of efforts there have really been invested into trying to make sense from data which is intrinsically very different. So you do have in the set of data that we were using, for example, data which is qualitative, telling you whether a specific measure is being adopted or not, and data which is of more quantitative nature, for example, the carbon price being adopted by organizations, or the amount of investments being committed. There are data that come from that is about coalitions. It's about how entities, whether an entity or not, is adhering to certain coalitions, and what commitments are defining that participation to that coalitions, and data which instead are about tracking the performance over the time. And then we have some data which are about trends that show progress over the years, and data which are about benchmarks which that define comparators for the data themselves. So this is in a nutshell like the type of effort that we did in trying to make sense of all this data. And of course, as we were sorting this out, we ended up updating and refining our framework. And we will update and refine it the more data we will be able to collect and gather over the time. In terms of institutions, this was the institution we ended up focusing on. Is very much the result of, first of all, like the availability of the data themselves. So because it was a data-driven effort, we collected information of all institutions that were covered from the data sets that we were able to achieve. And these data sets, some of them also include information regarding corporates. So corporates are indeed being covered in this exercise. So I hope this answered both questions.
Thank you, Valerio. And I think with that, we have exhausted the questions that have come in already, but please do feel free to come forward with others now or afterwards. Thanks for all of the great questions for those that did share them. Please do take a look at the Net Zero Finance Tracker at netzerofinancetracker.org and share with any colleagues that you think might find it useful. We'd really welcome your comments and feedback at any time and at any level. If you spot a typo or functionality issues, through to questions about the data and how we can collaborate to use this data to inform decision making. As this is a beta, we're really keen to get feedback from this community about what would be most useful in the next iteration of this work. Our goal is to expand the tracker to a global platform with country drill downs like the one you've seen today on the UK dashboard. And it's quite an ambitious goal. So it'd be really helpful to hear from you about specific use cases that you think would be most helpful from your perspective and the sector that you work in. Please now, I think it'd be remiss though to not state that we are looking for funding to continue this work. We'd be happy to do any bilateral presentations and answer any questions that funders might have about supporting the work of the tracker going forward, or to discuss any collaborations with potential partners. So with that, let me say thank you very much for joining us today. On the next slide, you can see the team's contact information if you'd like to get in touch. Thank you for all of your excellent questions today. I hope you'll continue to stay engaged on the Net Zero Finance Tracker as we move forward with the next stages. Have a great day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.